Thank you for all of you for coming here. I want to talk to you today about the future of Europe and about the future of the world as a whole, because today you cannot really separate these two. Everybody knows that the old order is in trouble. But does anybody know what the new order would look like? What new order will dominate the world? Do you know what is the new story of the world? To answer this question, let's start by briefly looking at a few of the old stories. During the 20th century, three big stories tried to explain the whole of human history and to offer a vision for the future of Europe and for the future of the world as a whole. These were the fascist, the communist, and the liberal stories. The fascist story said that history is a struggle between different nations, and fascism envisioned a world dominated by one human group that violently subdues all the others. The communist story explained that history is not a struggle between nations, but rather a struggle between classes. And communism envisioned a world in which all human groups are united by a centralized social system that ensures equality even at the price of freedom. The liberal story explains that history is a struggle not between nations and not between classes, but rather a struggle between liberty and tyranny. And liberalism envisioned a world in which all humans cooperate freely and peacefully, with minimum central control, even at the price of some inequality. Now, the Second World War and the Cold War, as we all know, knocked out the fascist and communist stories. And for the last few decades, the world has been governed by the global liberal order. This order is based on the understanding that all humans share some core experiences and interests, that we are all subject to the same universal values, and that no human group is inherently superior to the others. Cooperation is therefore much more sensible than conflict. All humans should work together to protect our common values and to advance our common interests. That's what liberalism said. And to foster such cooperation, liberalism has advised us to strengthen international laws and organizations and to ease the movement of ideas, of goods, and of people across the globe. Now, though the global liberal order has had many faults and problems, it has proved superior to all the alternatives. The liberal world of the early 21st century is more prosperous, more healthy, and more peaceful than ever before. For the first time in human history, you are more likely to die from obesity than from starvation. For the first time in history, you are more likely to die from old age than from plague. And you are more likely to die from an accident than from human violence. The liberal miracle can be summarized in the idea that liberalism created a world in which sugar is more dangerous than gunpowder. The average Austrian today is far more likely to die from eating too much chocolate than from being blown up by Al-Qaeda or some other organization. That's the amazing liberal miracle. If you think we should go back to some pre-liberal golden age that once existed, I would like to know the year you're thinking about. The year in which humankind was in better shape than in the early 21st century. Was it 1919 or 1219, or are you dreaming of going back even further? Nevertheless, people in Europe and in many other parts of the world are now losing faith in the liberal order. Nationalists and religious views that privilege one human group above all the others are back in fashion. Governments are increasingly restricting the flow of ideas, of goods, and of people, and are undermining international laws and international organizations. Walls are popping up everywhere, on the ground, in cyberspace, and especially inside the mind. The walls are beginning to rise again. If the liberal order, for whatever reason, is indeed collapsing, the big question to ask is what new kind of global order might replace it. So far, those who challenge the liberal order do so mainly on the national level. They have many ideas how to advance the interests of their own country, but they don't offer a viable vision for how the world as a whole should function. For example, Russian nationalism can be a reasonable guide for managing the affairs of Russia. But Russian nationalism has no plan for the rest of humanity. Unless, of course, nationalism morphs into imperialism and calls for one nation to violently conquer and rule the entire world. A century ago, many nationalists indeed harbored such imperialist fantasies. But today's nationalists, whether in Russia, in Turkey, in Italy, or in China, so far don't advocate global conquest. So, what is their vision of the world? In place of violently establishing a global empire, some nationalists, like Viktor Orban in Hungary, like the Italian Lega, like the British Brexiteers, dream about a peaceful nationalist international. They argue that all nations today actually face the same enemies. The boogeymen of globalism, multiculturalism, and immigration are threatening to destroy the traditions and identities of all nations. Therefore, they say, nationalists across the world should make common cause in opposing these globalist forces. Hungarians, Italians, and Brits should build walls, destroy bridges, and slow down the movement of people, goods, and ideas. The world will then be divided into distinct nation-states, each with its own sacred identity and traditions, and based on mutual respect for these differing identities, all nation-states would be able to exist, to coexist peacefully. Hungary will be Hungarian, Italy will be Italian, Britain will be British, and everybody will know who they are and what is their proper place in the world. This will be a world without immigration, without universal values, without multiculturalism, and without a global elite, but with peaceful international relations and some trade. In a word, the Nationalist International envisions the world as a network of walled but friendly fortresses. The key problem with this vision is that walled fortresses are seldom friendly. Each national fortress usually wants a bit more land, a bit more security, and a bit more prosperity for itself at the expense of the neighbors. And without the help of universal values and global organizations, rival fortresses cannot agree on any common rules. All previous attempts in history to divide the world into clear-cut nations have resulted in war and genocide. But, you can say, if I happen to live inside a particularly strong nation, strong fortress, like the USA or the UK or Germany or Russia, why should I care? Some nationalists indeed adopt a more extreme isolationist position. They don't believe in a global empire, but also they don't believe in a global network of fortresses. Instead, they deny the necessity of having any global order whatsoever. Our fortress, they say, should just raise the drawbridges, and the rest of the world can go to hell. We should refuse entry to foreign people, to foreign goods, and to foreign ideas. And as long as our walls are strong and the guards are loyal, who cares what happens to the foreigners? Such extreme isolationism, however, is completely divorced from economic realities. Without a global trade network, all existing national economies will collapse, including even that of North Korea. Many countries will not be able to even feed themselves without global trade. Nationalist leaders sometimes may therefore heap abuse on the global trade network, but none thinks seriously of taking their country completely out of the global network. And we just can't have a global trade network without some global order that sets the rules of the game. Even more importantly, whether people like it or not, humankind today faces three unprecedented common problems that make a mockery of national borders and can only be solved through global cooperation. These are nuclear war, climate change, and technological disruption. You cannot build a wall against nuclear winter. You cannot build a wall against global warming. And no nation can regulate artificial intelligence and bioengineering by itself, because no government controls all the scientists and engineers in the world. Consider, for example, conducting genetic engineering experiments on humans. Every country will say, we don't want to conduct such experiments. We are the good guys. But how do we know that our rivals are not doing it? We cannot trust them, and we cannot allow them to be ahead of us, so we must do it before they do it. Or similarly, consider developing autonomous weapon systems, killer robots. Again, every country will say this is a very dangerous technology and it should be regulated carefully, but we can't trust our rivals to regulate it, so we must develop it first. That will be the safe thing to do. If we allow such an AI arms race or a genetic arms race to develop, it doesn't matter who wins the arms race. The loser will be humanity. And the only thing that can prevent such destructive arms races is not building walls between countries, but rather building trust between countries, which is not impossible. If, for example, today the Germans come to the French and tell them, trust us, we aren't developing killer robots in some secret laboratory under the Bavarian Alps, the French are very likely to trust the Germans, despite the terrible history of these two countries. We need to at least try build such trust globally. We need to reach a point when the Americans and the Chinese can trust one another like the French and the Germans. Similarly, we need to create a global safety net to protect all humans against the economic shocks that AI is very likely to unleash. Automation will create immense new wealth in high-tech hubs like Silicon Valley and Eastern China. But the worst effects will be felt in developing countries whose economies depend on cheap manual labor. There will be many more jobs for software engineers in California, but fewer jobs for Mexican truck drivers and factory workers. Unless we find solutions to this crisis on a global level, then entire countries might collapse, and the resulting chaos, violence, and waves of immigration will destabilize the entire world. I think this is the proper perspective to look at recent developments in Europe, like the crisis of the European Union and Brexit. In itself, Brexit isn't necessarily such a bad idea. But the real question is one of focus. Is this what Britain and the EU should be focusing on right now? How does Brexit help prevent nuclear war? How does Brexit help to prevent climate change? How does Brexit help to regulate AI and bioengineering? Quite obviously, instead of helping, Brexit actually makes it harder to solve all of these problems. And every minute that the EU and UK spend on Brexit is one less minute they spend on climate change or on the AI crisis. In 20 years, if we have failed to prevent climate change and to regulate AI, our children will look back and ask us, why didn't you do it in time? What will we say? Sorry, kids, we were just far too busy with Brexit, so we didn't have time for these smaller issues. So in order to survive and flourish in the 21st century, Europe and humankind as a whole need better global cooperation. And nationalism need not prove an impossible barrier for such cooperation. I know that some politicians, like Donald Trump, argue that there is an inherent contradiction between nationalism and globalism, and that we should reject globalism and choose nationalism. But I think this is a fundamental mistake. There is no contradiction between nationalism and globalism. For nationalism isn't about hating foreigners. Nationalism is about taking care of your compatriots. And in the 21st century, in order to protect the safety and prosperity of your compatriots, you must cooperate with foreigners. So I think today good nationalists should also be globalists. There is no contradiction there. And globalism doesn't mean abandoning all national loyalties and traditions, and doesn't mean opening the border to unlimited immigration. There is a conspiracy theory going around also in Austria that globalists want to abolish all restrictions on immigration and to flood Europe with tens of millions of foreigners. But this is really nonsense. I know quite a few globalists, and none of them wants that. Rather, globalism actually means two far more modest and reasonable things. First of all, globalism means a commitment to some global rules. These rules don't deny the uniqueness of each nation and the loyalty that people should owe to their nation. Rather, the global rules just regulate the relations between nations. A good way to think about it, or a good model for the world, is the World Football Cup. The World Cup is a competition between nations, and people often show fierce loyalty to their national team. But at the same time, the World Football Cup is also an amazing display of global harmony. France cannot play football against Croatia unless the French and the Croatians first agree on the same rules for the game. 1,000 years ago, in the 11th century, it would have been absolutely impossible to bring people from France, Croatia, Japan, and Argentina to play games together in Russia. Even if you could somehow solve the logistical problem and bring them there, they could never agree on the same rules. But today we can do that, and that's globalism in action. If you like the World Football Cup, then you're a globalist. The second principle of globalism is that sometimes it is necessary to prefer global interests over national interests. Not always, but sometimes. For example, in the World Football Cup, all national teams agree not to use forbidden drugs to enhance the performance of their athletes. Even if you can win the cup by drugging your football players, you shouldn't do it, because if you do it, then other teams will soon copy your example and the World Football Cup will become a competition between biochemists and not between football players. And the sport will be ruined. As in football, so also in economics. We need to find a balance between national and global interests. Even in a globalized world, the vast majority of the taxes you pay will still go to provide healthcare and education for people in your nation. But sometimes nations will agree to slow down their economic development or their technological development in order to prevent catastrophic climate change and to prevent the spread of dangerous technologies. So this isn't a call to establish some kind of global government, which is an unrealistic and dangerous vision. Rather, the goal should be to have harmony without uniformity. It's like an orchestra in which each instrument is different, but they can still all play in harmony. If all the instruments are the same, it is lifeless. If each instrument is doing its own thing in complete disregard of the others, what you get is terrible noise. We need to find some kind of balanced middle path. And the EU has been, so far, the most successful experiment in the history of humankind in finding such a middle path and creating effective cooperation between hundreds of millions of people without imposing uniformity, without imposing a single government, a single language, or a single nationality on everybody. And I very much hope that this experiment in harmony without uniformity can set the way forward for humanity as a whole, for Europe to serve as a model for the rest of the world. And that's basically my vision for Europe, that Europe should teach the world how to cooperate peacefully without imposing a single domineering system or government above everybody. Now, to conclude, what does all this mean in practice in terms of the next few months, of the next year? So I would say it means giving more weight to global problems and interests within the existing framework of nation states. And elections are coming on, the EU elections and later national elections. And when the next elections come along, I would advise you to ask politicians 4 questions when they are asking you to vote for them. You should ask them 4 questions. First, if you're elected, what actions will you take to lessen the risks of nuclear war? Secondly, what actions will you take to lessen the risks of climate change? What actions will you take to regulate disruptive technologies like artificial intelligence and bioengineering? And finally, how do you see the world of 2050? What is your worst case scenario and what is your vision for the best case scenario? Because we need visions for the future. And if some politicians don't understand these questions, or if they constantly talk about the past without being able to formulate a meaningful vision for the future, don't vote for these politicians. Thank you.